the potential approaches for CDB borrowing members to build adaptive capacity for creating urban resilience. And we're hoping that the seminar will facilitate a discussion on the strategic response for building urban resilience, the requirements for behavioural change, and we'll also look at the proposed CDB urban sector policy objectives of governance, sustainable urban development, social inclusion and security, mobility and infrastructure, climate change and the environment, and the urban economy. I'd really like to introduce the panel that I have with me today. First of all, I'd like to introduce the Honourable Charlene Cartwright-Robinson, the Premier Minister of Finance for the Turks and Caicos Islands. Very, very pleased to have you here today. Also, Dr. Janice Cumberbatch, who is from the Centre for Resource Management and Environmental Studies at the University of West Indies, and was also part of the team which completed the new urban sector policy. Also, Leonard Francis, the Director for the National Environment and Planning Agency in Jamaica, and CDB's own Kavon White, who's an Operations Officer and the bank's focal point for urban development and housing. But before we get to our panel discussion, I'd really like to welcome to the stage Timothy Antoine, who has very kindly stepped in to be our keynote speaker today. He is the Governor of the Central Bank of the Eastern Caribbean and will give the opening remarks. So may I invite you to the stage.
So thank you very much and good afternoon to everyone. First of all, as you see, I'm not Prime Minister Skerritt. So you should not expect a keynote address, but I hope to deliver some key messages, and I would be grateful if you took careful note. So that said, I've been asked to share some perspectives, drawing on my Hurricane Ivan experience and, of course, my experience in the vineyard of public service as a financial secretary for many years. I start with a simple definition of resilience, which is sort of the working definition, and I think it's similar to what I saw in the paper, when I had a look at it quickly this morning. Resilience refers to the capacity to withstand, adapt, and rapidly recover from shocks and stresses. Withstand, adapt, and rapidly recover. So let's keep those in mind as we go along. Now, of course, against the backdrop of the hurricanes of last year, and with the imminent, soon arrival of the hurricane season of this year, very much climate risk at top of mind. But I dare say there are many other risks, including geopolitical, financial, economic, among others. So let me share a few perspectives which I hope will perhaps provide a framework, a broader framework for some of what the urban planners will talk about later. I'm not an urban planner, so I won't be speaking to that. And I feel fortified in what I will say based on what I heard this morning, first in our prayer by Reverend Dr. James, then by Prime Minister Mitchell, and then by President Smith. So perhaps we are all on the same page. Now, a few days after Hurricane Ivan in 2004, those of you recall it was September 7, 2004, I received a call from one of our credit rating agencies. And the call went something like this. Well, not something like this. This was a call. Mr. Antoine, how are you? I said, well, personally, I'm not doing too badly. My home was not destroyed. But my country is devastated. We have to rebuild. They then said to me, there were two people on the call, one male, one female. Mr. Antoine, we're so sorry. They offered their sympathies. And then there was a pause on the phone, and I waited to see, of course, what assistance might be forthcoming for my devastated country. And the next sentence was, oh, by the way, we are going to have to downgrade Grenada. And as I listened to that, and then they said goodbye and all the best wishes. And that was the end of the phone call. So the phone, I replaced the receiver, and I'm just recalling that conversation, replaying that in my mind. And I'm thinking, how cold, how callous, how uncaring. And yet, perhaps they will argue they were just doing their jobs. That experience is seared in my conscience. And it is a big motivator for the 2 points I'm going to make on this issue of fiscal and debt resilience. Because we can talk about planning all we want, but it has to be within the context, a macro context, to support what we want to do in our cities. So I have been advocating for the longest while the need for standstill debt clauses in our debt instruments. And the big motivation for that is what I experienced on that call in that September, 14 years ago. In 2015, well, 14 and then 15, Grenada was able to negotiate into its debt restructured arrangements a clause. We call it loosely a hurricane clause. We did it first with the bilateral creditors, and then we did it with the commercial creditors, and then we did it with the Paris Club in 2015. And essentially, this says what the President mentioned this morning. For a qualifying event, disaster of a certain magnitude, there will be a standstill such that it will not constitute a default. And that will, of course, allow the country to have much needed liquidity, while at the same, and to begin the recovery process without the need for a default event. Why is that important? Because defaults are expensive and costly, not just in terms of reputation, but time and legal work when you have to restructure debt instruments. And so I would make the point, it is the worst possible time after a hurricane, in the immediate aftermath, to be trying to restructure or renegotiate debt. It's the worst possible time. The precious resources in the Ministry of Finance, precious and scarce, have to be focused on rebuilding, and that's the worst time to have to spend on that. And I know because I lived that experience. And so we're advocating for what is now called in the literature state contingent debt instruments. And so recently, having visited Washington, I then wrote to both the managing director of the IMF and the president of the World Bank about collaborating with us in the ECCU and the wider region. I also copied in our distinguished Secretary General of CARICOM to see how we can have common cause on this issue. Because really the point is, we want to avoid a situation where countries have to do these things on their own after an event when they have to go through restructuring alone. What we're proposing is a standard treatment that will be in all instruments for all, at least small states. I suspect the larger states may have an interest in this, but I'm coming to it from a small state, and I believe that is part of building debt resilience. So that is an idea which we are strongly advocating, and I put it to you this afternoon, and it comes out of my lived experience, Hurricane Ivan. The second idea, which is not new, and we heard it several times today, is the need for fiscal resilience frameworks. Now, you hitherto would have heard people refer to them as fiscal rules. You heard it called fiscal responsibility. I frame it as fiscal resilience. Because to my mind, in the context of building resilience in the region at this time, we need to stop thinking about this in this negative, pejorative way as somebody trying to handcuff a government from not doing this or not doing that. We need to appreciate that it is not if, it is when the storms come and what magnitude. And the question is, in that context, what do we have to provide, as it were, counter-cyclical fiscal policy? I know from personal experience after the global financial crisis that many of the countries in the region found themselves cutting capital expenditure and, in a sense, making the situation worse because there were no buffers, no fiscal space to smooth expenditure and to ease the pressure on the population. And that is what fiscal resilience framework is all about. So I put it this way, in cricketing terms, because most of us appreciate cricket. A batsman, and I think that means male and female today, can only make runs if the batsman is at the crease, if they're in the middle. Now, there's always a risk that the batsman could get clean ball with the first ball with a wicked yorker. That's a risk. Or a searing bouncer. That's a risk. But if he or she is able to survive and play for some time, chances are they'll make some runs. What am I saying? We have to give small states a chance. We have to give our Caribbean countries a chance. And the fighting chance starts with getting a fiscal framework in place. So I'm very pleased to see that Grenada, having introduced that law in 2015, and before that Anguilla, Jamaica also, Grenada went a step further and put in an independent panel to review and supervise governments' adherence to the framework. In other words, to certify compliance to Parliament annually. I am now pleased to see that the new Minister of Finance, Dr. Clark, has announced there will be a fiscal council in Jamaica. And I think that's a step in the right direction. So I make this point this afternoon to say, let's stop this in fact, futile discussion about fiscal responsibility and rules and sort of get into a negative discussion and focus on resilience. And in that context, these are the two ideas I want to strongly advocate and encourage. The second is this. I was in Anguilla last week, one of the hurricane-impacted countries, Hurricane Irma, and I asked one of the top counselors there, well, how are we doing in terms of the counseling support? How is the nation doing? And he was saying to me, well, I've had inundated with requests from individuals, groups, even businesses trying to cope. And I recall our own experience in Grenada. One colleague in the Ministry of Finance, anytime the wind started to howl, she would literally have an anxiety attack because she was reliving the experience of Hurricane Ivan. And for many people, that was very traumatic, long after the storm had passed. What am I saying? We have to invest in terms of building resilient cities, building resilient communities in psychosocial infrastructure. And we have to make sure that that infrastructure is in place and can be deployed very rapidly in the event of a disaster. Anecdotally, I am seeing and hearing of increased incidents of mental health issues, and some of that has to be attributed to some of these shocks. I'm not saying that's the only thing. And so the question is, as we speak, there are folks in Dominica who are extremely anxious about the next hurricane season because they are still picking up the pieces of the last season. That is a very important issue. And I remember Prime Minister Mitchell making that point after Hurricane Ivan, and some people kind of scoffed and some people laughed, and why was he going on about psychosocial? But if you run in a country and you understand 200% of GDP, perhaps you understand that it is no respect of persons, whether you are the highest level in the land, the head of government, or you, everybody, to some degree, needed support. Some of us drew on our faith, some of us drew on our peers, and some of us didn't make it. Because there were people who passed away in the aftermath, and we can only conclude that they succumbed to the pressure and strain of the time. So psychosocial counseling and that support is something that I think we need to see more of. I was very pleased to see a couple of weeks ago when I was at the commencement ceremony at St. George's University that they have an increasing program, increasing enrollment in psychology and counseling. And I thought that's very important because I'm not sure how many countries have it as a national priority in the national training list. But I will argue in building resilience at this time, that needs to be in there. I say no more. Let me move on. So first of all, I spoke about fiscal and debt. I've now talked about psychosocial. The third area I want to touch very briefly, because I think I have 5 minutes left, is the idea of financial resilience. Now, the reality is that whenever we have these storms, most of the time, what do we find? The governments have to operate. Why? Because we have very little insurance in our region. We are underinsured at many levels. And the reality is that as a result of that, very often it is the governments that have to come in and sort of fill that breach. That has direct implications for fiscal and debt. And I ask my citizens, my colleagues, to connect the dots. Because it is the same government that is going to have to find a way, whether that is through borrowing, debt, more taxes, which of course nobody particularly likes, to help negotiate those needs. And therefore, I think we need, as part of building our financial resilience for resilient communities, resilient cities, to look at the notion of how we build out risk transfer instruments. And here I want to speak not just of catastrophe insurance, which of course is what CRIF offers, and I want to make a plug, full disclosure, I'm a member of CRIF's board, for more countries to do more in terms of taking out more insurance coverage. That is important, even as countries also invest in disaster risk reduction in country on the ground. CRIF has proven itself over time. It's now disbursed in excess of $140 million, I believe, over its 10 years of existence. It has served us well, but it needs to scale up. And therefore, there needs to be a commitment to do that, both by our governments as well as our development partners, to create that additional vehicle. But as someone remarked in one of the disaster countries, so often we focus on saving lives, but not enough on securing livelihoods. And that is the issue. How do we secure livelihoods? And I'm putting to you this afternoon that one of the ways to help further secure livelihoods would in fact be the use of microinsurance products. So that would be in the fishing sector, in the farming sector. And I see the CEO of CRIF is here, sitting very attentively, and I know he's working very hard with the team and our board to push forward on some of these products, to make them available to our farmers, our fisher folk, and so on, to be able to help to fill that gap. So I want to commend that area to the region. I know we've had a difficult history with insurance. I know many of us are still fresh and feeling the pain of Clico. But I would also argue, because it is so important, we have to pay attention to this issue of insurance supervision, regulation, and supervision. So I would argue and constantly ask, how much work is being done by colleges of regulators in respect of the financial conglomerates that we have in the region? And by colleges, we simply mean a coming together of regulators to look at a particular company, to assess its compliance and to assess its strength, and to be able to make appropriate remedial action and to collaborate to ensure monitoring for effective implementation. So that requires us to come together, not in a single country, but across countries, to be able to keep the spotlight and to keep the focus on these, in some cases now we would argue, too big to fail insurance companies. So that's financial resilience. I'm going to say two other things before I conclude. I think we all have a concept of the need to harden both our physical and digital infrastructure. And certainly I recall in the case of Grenada after Hurricane Ivan, at the time Ivan was Category 3. I think by the time it got to Jamaica, it may have been Category 4. But the government took the decision to strengthen the building code and to insist that we build at least for Category 3. Now, of course, after Hurricanes Irma and Maria last year, we're all talking about Category 5. And by the way, it is unofficial that those were Category 7s. You know that, all right? Category 5 on steroids, so I think they get to be 7. Now, that was not officially announced, but from people who saw hurricanes for the last 50 years, they said they were Category 7s. My point is that we clearly have to harden the infrastructure. I am particularly concerned about our telecoms infrastructure. I remember texting with Prime Minister Skerritt not too long before Hurricane Maria, and then communication ceased. And for a while, nobody could communicate. I mean, I think in the end, it was ham radios. So how do we communicate effectively to share information, bring attention to needs, and create rapid response outside of the islands? That, for me, is a fix that we have to work on, this issue of digital infrastructure. And by the way, let me also make this point. We have to focus on this issue of communications. So many people outside of the Caribbean seem not to have understood that the Caribbean is made up of many islands. And we're very tourist dependent. So many people rapidly concluded that the Caribbean was closed for business and no tourists were going there. In fact, I remember going to the United States a few weeks after, and which country you came from? The Caribbean? Really? Well, it's like they were almost touching me to see if I was real, because as far as they're concerned, the Caribbean had been destroyed. And so I make this point to say, given how dependent we are on tourism, we have to put communication in our business continuity plans. And here I'm particularly making a call for us to communicate with the public, well, the world, about our tourism product, our market, what is available and what is not. Because what happened is that some countries found that they had collateral damage, because all of a sudden, although they had no direct damage, they were also facing a reduction in traffic because people assumed that the islands were closed. We have to address that frontally. I know CTO has done some work, but this is an area we have to push. Now, as central bank governor, I have an interest, because at the end of the day, it's about foreign exchange coming in and foreign reserves. So this is not just about tourism, let's be clear. The other issue is that the need for us to have proactive communication with the credit rating agencies. So I go back to my story in September 2004, and I'm thinking, what I know now, I didn't know then, we need to ensure that in our business continuity plans, we have effective communication. Because in the absence of information, they will assume the worst, and they will do things that are unhelpful, and in some cases unnecessary. And so we need to make sure that we do that. I suspect my 10 minutes are up. They did not tell me whether it was 10 minutes US or EC, but I will assume it's EC. And therefore, I will conclude by saying, as we think about this issue of building resilience, let's look to adopt debt and fiscal resilience frameworks. Let us enhance our psychosocial support mechanisms. Let us deepen our financial resilience using risk transfer instruments, harden our physical and digital infrastructure, and improve our communications, both within and outside of the region. I trust these thoughts are useful. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much. So I think we're now going to show a short video that will describe CDB's planned urban policy. So if I can ask that to be loaded, thank you.
The urban sector is a key driver of economic growth in our region, and the bank recognizes that an updated urban policy is important to assisting our countries in enhancing that sector and achieving the sustainable development goal of making our cities safer, more resilient, and more inclusive.
To me, a resilient city is one that approaches urban development in a holistic manner. It is a city that is resilient to climate change, a city where citizen security has been addressed and where citizens feel safe to move around and to live and to enjoy themselves without the fear of being victims of crime.
A resilient city is one which can withstand present and future shocks, these shocks being economic, environmental, social and institutional.
Within the context of urban economy, a resilient city must work to create wealth, reduce inequality, create jobs, while at the same time securing the environment within a context such that we can all enjoy today, tomorrow, and in the future.
A resilient city is one that can absorb, accommodate, and recover from the impact of a disaster in a timely manner without any significant disruption to the economic activity.
Roughly 2/3 of the land area in our region is defined as urban. Those are the areas which also have the greatest economic activity. And since economic growth is a priority for the region, then we need to manage those areas properly.
When building resilient cities, we need to consider the position of vulnerable and disadvantaged groups. These include women who head households, persons with disabilities, the unemployed and underemployed, youth, children, and indigenous persons and immigrants. These groups are often excluded from decision-making processes and have limited resources to assets.
Natural resource conservation is also a very important part of resilient cities. Chief among them, water. In urban areas, there's always a high demand for water. And based on the increasing frequency of droughts and the long periods of drought that we're having, there's a tendency for water to become scarce in urban areas.
Recognizing the need for a coordinated approach to developing our urban spaces, CDB is creating the urban sector strategy, policy and operational guidelines to guide all of our future investments within the urban sector. What the policy seeks to do is to respond to SDG 11, which articulates the need to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And so within our urban policy, what we are seeking to do is to ensure that our board member countries and the investments we make in this space guide the development of the urban sector to achieving this outcome within the desired period of 2030.
So here in the Eastern Caribbean, the UNDP is focused on 4 major things. That's building a safe, secure and just region, a equitable and prosperous region, a healthy Caribbean, and a sustainable and resilient Caribbean.
Any new infrastructure development which will take place, or any replacement of existing infrastructure, will have to take the question of resiliency into consideration. Because as the retail hub of Barbados, it is very important that after a disaster, The city should be able to absorb, accommodate, and recover from that impact in a timely manner in an effort to ensure that economic activity continues.
CDB's urban policy will be utilized to address these challenges, where the policy objectives will include good governance, enhanced urban infrastructure and mobility, enhanced urban development. We'll also look at security, welfare, and social inclusion. We'll also look at climate change and the environment, and also urban economy.
Last year, the UNDP and CDB signed a memorandum of understanding to allow us to work together, and right now we are supporting the implementation of a loan, a CDB loan, that the government of BVI has. We'll help it to build more climate resilient infrastructure that also includes the city of Roadtown.
The Caribbean Development Bank, CDB, recognizes the importance of the urban sector to the sustainable social and economic development of our borrowing member countries and to the region as a whole. We are therefore committed to assisting our governments to meet the sustainable development goal of making our cities safer, more inclusive, and more resilient.
It would be really great if I could maybe ask the panelists to briefly respond to the video, and maybe I could start with Premier Robinson. Would you like to just tell us a little bit about the steps that you've taken in Turks and Caicos on kind of post and proactive disaster risk mitigation?
Yes, thank you very much. I want to clear something first, because the governor for the Eastern Caribbean Bank says urban experts or urban planners. I'm just the unlucky Caribbean leader that had 2 storms hit my country after being elected for 9 months. So I'm by no way an expert, but certainly I'm learning in the University of Hard Knocks how to rebuild and rebuild resiliently. Turks and Caicos, of course, among the other territories that were hit, did suffer impact from both storms. We ended up with about 80% in terms of damage to critical infrastructure. Our housing ranged from each island, and we are a multi-island destination, which in itself presents different challenges. But each island had impact on their critical infrastructure, and be it the housing or government buildings, schools, communication, airports, the prison, police. In fact, in Providenciales, the headquarters was displaced. So we will widely impact our infrastructure. We knew then, of course, that storms are going to come, and they're going to come more frequently and certainly more intense, having suffered Ike just less than 10 years before, almost to the date. So we then had to make the decision that either we rebuild every time or we rebuild resiliently to be able to withstand. We recognized very quickly that it is very time-consuming. It is difficult to sell to people who want everything that is happening now, and it's also costly. So we've now, in the time post the storm, actually before the storm, we had already engaged with a consultant for a National Physical Development Plan, which is very, very critical for us in terms of looking at land use, because primarily we would have focused on flood-prone areas. But with the threat of the upsurge and what had happened to our coastal lines, our coastlines, we, of course, then have to look at building even resorts that want to be on the beach. How do we move forward with that? So we have a study that is actually going on with that as well. We are pleased, though we were impacted by both storms, that our infrastructure really withstood the storms. Our planning code was built to Category 5. So much of the damage, though 100% on each island, in some islands, and 62 in the lowest, we only suffered roofing damage, and we lost probably about 400 homes throughout the entire Turks and Caicos, largely level 1, which is just roofing damage. So we do know that you can build and rebuild resiliently. Of course, much of those homes were repaired after Hurricane Ike. We suffered complete loss of communication, and we are fortunate in that the companies that provide communication services to us are now building redundancy and going underground. So that is certainly helping us. Additionally, we had the unfortunate experience of having over 17 1,000 persons affected by having their homes impacted in one way or the other. We have the usual Caribbean experience, and this is perhaps one of our greatest challenges, of having persons who are underinsured or not insured at all. And that is only about 20%. So whilst we appreciate that we have a housing issue even with the legal residents who refuse to insure their homes, so we also have large squatting communities, informal settlements. So we would have spent quite a bit of time upgrading our planning ordinance, making sure that we strengthen the enforcement laws, making sure that we give additional manpower to carry out those enforcement, to make sure that with the bust, the increase in work that was happening, that contractors weren't taking shortcuts, and also making sure that people weren't rebuilding in these substandard homes. We also had the challenge, of course, of water being cut off. We do have still a large number of persons who use cisterns, but we're leaning heavily now on reverse osmosis. Of course, we lost electricity in all of the islands, and we're pleased that our company, which is a private sector company, was able to even receive an international award of being able to restore electricity over 60 days in all of the islands. So we had key installation for areas like water, airport, prison, and of course our critical government agencies like the Treasury and police, and prison, of course, I said that already. But we made sure that when we look at building through our physical development plan, and when we look at the mapping that we've just concluded of our flood-prone areas, that we're looking at the best use of land, of course, hiding our interest stand more so than before on our coastline, and how do we build there to make sure we capture what residents or developers would like to see, in terms of enjoying our beach. We also have the issue of mobility. Being a multi-island destination, that remains our single greatest challenge, and that we were cut off. And two of the islands that we actually had to evacuate is because we feared the causeway that links two of our major islands would have been destroyed or damaged, and an elderly population on the island of Middle Caicos, our largest island, would have been cut off. Or Salkey, which is separated from Grand Turk, which is another elderly population. So we asked for those islands to be evacuated, but of course you can imagine the elderly people feel their houses were built a long time ago and they can withstand anything. So we now have the challenge of trying to figure out how do we move from island to island. How do we ensure that post the storm we are able to reach persons and they're not cut off? So imagine the perfect storm, you're cut off by communication, you're cut off by water that you can't access because it's dangerous or the bridge is out. So we have that ongoing challenge. But in terms of transport on land, we appreciate even with the land use development plan that we are able to identify areas. We'll be able to identify areas where we can build roads to ensure that there's easier access. We are also in the advancing our plans of providing public transportation. That is critical, also mentioned in the study, and looking definitely at how do we link certain other islands by a causeway, and so you would hear us continue to speak about the spine link. But Turks and Caicos has had the opportunity to rebuild, and we consider it an opportunity more than anything else, and we are going to certainly be committed to rebuilding resiliently. We are very advanced in our climate change policy, which is going to go through every policy initiative, and we also have the support of UNDP that provided us an economic advisor where we're building in disaster risk reduction as well as climate change action in all of our public investment. So we are well on our way in the Turks and Caicos, and we are actually very good examples that you can build and rebuild resiliently so that each storm, it reduces the impact and the cost and the loss that, of the damage. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe I can now bring in Dr. Cumberbatch to talk to us about the importance of social inclusion and security.
Sorry?
Maybe I could bring you in to talk about social inclusion and security and the role that that plays in resilience.
Of course. I'd actually like to take a different slant on it, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And ask people if they consider themselves vulnerable. Because we have an image of what the vulnerable look like. So I am coming at social inclusion but I suspect that everybody in this room and several of the people who are following us think that they fall outside of the group that we're targeting. So, if there were a hurricane tomorrow, do you have proper insurance coverage? And if I were in my classroom, I'd have you all standing and I'd let you sit if you could answer these questions correctly. So by now, maybe 2 people may have sat down. So do you have adequate insurance coverage? How much water do you have? How long can you stand until the water comes back on? Do you know how much water you need to keep going? A few more, maybe 3 more people would have sat down, right? If you have a particular illness and you have to have regular treatments at hospital, it might be something severe, like dialysis, or it might be just the run-of-the-mill, non-communicable disease, like high blood pressure, or, you know, one of these things that requires you to have a regular doctor's check. Do you have enough medication, and for how long? Does it have to be refrigerated? How many of you are now feeling a little bit more vulnerable? A tad more vulnerable? Our image of who's vulnerable in the region changed immediately last year when we realized that it isn't just the homeless people who are vulnerable. It isn't just the female-headed households who are vulnerable. All of us are one hurricane away from being homeless. There is one economic policy away from financial ruin. And consequently, we have to rethink what it means to be vulnerable. If we want to deal with issues of social inclusion, we have to start with knowledge. We have to start collecting disaggregated data. One of the challenges that I faced doing my work in the region is going from country to country and trying to do analysis and understand where the vulnerable people are without the statistics to support the analysis. Because we don't have the disaggregated data on, well, we'll have gender, but I may not be able to find my disabled people. I may not be able to find my people living with HIV. And indeed, some of the things that I just asked you about, like whether you have the right insurance or a requisite amount of water, those questions don't get asked at all. So even some of the questions that need to be asked to determine and measure vulnerability aren't yet being asked. We do censuses every 10 years, and we do studies across that period anyway. And it's time that we start collecting disaggregated data that will allow us to find our vulnerable people and to identify ourselves in terms of our own vulnerability. And it's when we're able to do that that we can then do proper planning. If we understand where people's vulnerabilities lie, it perhaps will help deal with one of the challenges that the Premier raised, which is a particular concern for me, which is insurance. You want to get back on your feet very quickly after an event. That means that you should be properly insured. But the truth of the matter is that if I were so impolite as to ask the people in this room if they were properly insured, they could give me a whole list of other critical things that they need to spend their money on why they haven't perhaps insured or insured sufficiently. Now, when I'm able to point out their vulnerability, it perhaps puts it in a different light to them. And it's those sorts of things that we need to do when we start talking about being socially included, when we're talking about welfare. All of us in this room probably think that we are not a part of that group. But I'm telling you, one economic policy, one storm, and we have become a part of that group. So we have to ask the right questions, so we have to collect the correct data.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I could now hand over to you, Lennon, to talk a little bit more about what happens in Jamaica.
Well, thank you very much. All right, well, we have had several experiences with respect of hurricanes in Jamaica, and for us, we have had situations where, yes, we do have challenges, but we see them as opportunities. Mm-hmm. And Jamaica definitely has led the way, in my opinion, in finding the way through to actually overcome these challenges. We have had Gilbert, we have had Harlan, we have had numerous hurricanes and other storm events. And we have had hurricanes that actually, Gilbert was a roof hurricane. We have lost roofs. We've had situations where infrastructure has been damaged. But the people and the governance structure is what has helped us a whole lot to be very resilient. And we're actually, at the moment, at the stage we are at now, is that we have overcome these and we're actually moving forward. In the sense that our Prime Minister had said, listen, we now want to make our towns, our cities more resilient. And there's a proposal afoot now to actually look at creating a third city. There's a Vernon Field proposal there as well. For Kingston and St. Andrew itself, and for major city Kingston, there are efforts at actually climate proofing and actually making the city resilient. And what we have done is that we are actually looking at an urban regeneration program that is actually being pushed by our Prime Minister. And we are creating what has existed for some time, which is a Parliament Square, which has been a bit controversial in some respects, but this is something that is being pushed as well. We in respect of our governance structure, I know we'll address that further on, in that we're pushing more and more for actually to involve the various government groups and the non-government groups as well to be more inclusive in what we're doing. We are actually have now passed our new National Building Act, and we have now for the first time the entire island itself is actually covered by development orders that are at the various stages, but we have completed development orders for the entire island, various parishes. And some have been promulgated, some are actually awaiting to be promulgated as well. And at present, we are also in the process of doing a national spatial plan for the entire island. Why this is going to be important is that we will definitely be defining the areas within the island that you will not be allowed to build. Those areas will actually be zoned for particular purposes, because even though development orders identify some areas, the people have been able, I don't want to use informal settlements, have actually grown in some of these areas. And it is something that we are pushing to address. And hopefully we will overcome that challenge. In the various development orders, there are proposals within them to actually provide more low-income housing, and there are actually proposals to ensure that access to infrastructure and other factors are there. But I will leave it at that, so we can discuss it further on as we go.
Okay, well then, thank you. Nice to hear such brief and pithy remarks. Maybe I'd like to bring Kavon now in just to talk a little bit more about the kind of urban economy side of things.
One of the interesting things about the urban economy and the discussion about the urban economy in the revised urban sector policy and strategy is we want to take the approach in the bank as what is the contribution of everybody in the urban economic space to producing that GDP, and having that look, you will then see how do I play a part in that reconstruction after there is an event. Because it was very interesting when you have discussions with people on the ground and you say to them, in your urban space, the government set policies, there are locational decisions, there are investment decisions, products and services are traded, and you are part of that products and services. So in the case there is an event, you have to act within that space to help bring back or improve on what was there before. And it's very interesting because when you begin to start to have that discussion with our major stakeholders, and we start to have that discussion about adaptive resilience and dynamic resilience, and the fact that what we want is that dynamic resilience, especially within businesses. Because if we take the small and medium-sized enterprise, there's the mention about insurance. How do I get back up on my feet? And how fast do I get back on my feet? That's some discussions we're having within the policy, because we realize that while you have large enterprises who can get up and leave the country, a lot of the small and medium-sized enterprises which employ 20, 15, they can't leave. And they have to get the resources to get back up on their feet. And I think we'll take that approach in the policy, and you'll see where we not only look at adaptive measures in terms of after, what do you need to do before What sort of mitigation do you need? You need to make sure that you can maximize your income so that you have something to build upon going forward. And you'll see where we have linkages to new and emerging economies, the green, the blue. We talk about job creation. We talk about informal economies become more formal. And we will make sure that going forward, there is a discussion and a clear understanding within the urban space and the urban economy. What is everyone's contribution? And when there is that level of buy-in, there is a greater acceptance of issues about getting insurance, issues about security. And I think as we roll out this product, I'm going to be very happy because I know that there's going to be greater buy-in, not from only the people at the top, but the large people at the base of the pyramid.
Okay, thank you. Maybe to now kind of expand the discussion a bit, I think it would be really interesting for everybody to hear about what you think is really the greatest challenge. I mean, something that's really struck me from this conversation is getting buy-in from the population that they really are vulnerable. Is that the greatest challenge, or is there something bigger than that?
I would say the buy-in is the greatest challenge. As I look throughout the policy, it speaks to individuals playing their role. That is critical, because in order for any policy initiative to work, there has to be buy-in from the individual. So when we speak about energy, we speak about conservation. You know, so you know that you have to have individuals buying in. The greatest challenge, of course, is for the Caribbean to appreciate, or the minds of the Caribbean persons to appreciate disasters are here with us. Yes. They're here. So I am in a situation where we're a couple of days away from the new season. And whilst people are anxious, people are saying, oh, God is not going to do that to us again. We just had it. You know, and that was the feeling even last year when we had Irma, and 2 weeks later, Maria. Oh, it's not going to happen again. Because whilst you're a little anxious, you're still thinking, oh, the odds against us, we can't be that unlucky. So you have to try and, I shouldn't say exploit, but yes, exploit the vulnerability in their minds now to appreciate that it can happen back to back in 2 weeks, so it can happen back to back in a year, and that they must begin to change their minds. But when we look at building resilience, we usually look at the adult population now and talking about communication and all of this. But if you want to talk climate change and living more resilient existence, you really have to go into the schools. Because there are some generations you are definitely even kicking and dragging and bringing them along. You're not going to achieve what you need to, but we really have to go down to the children's levels.
Yes.
I'm glad that you, let's try that again. Yes. I'm glad that you touched on the children, because you call it buy-in, I call it re-socialization. We have to completely re-socialize. And socialization happens in the family, it happens in the church, it happens in formal and informal settings, and we have to re-socialize. We have to rethink. Hurricanes will come every year, and it's not going to be category 3 anymore. It's going to be 5 on steroids, 7, whatever you want to call it. That is our new norm. The current global political economy is what we live in. This is our new norm. So the Caribbean of the 60s, the Caribbean of the 50s, no. We have to be the Caribbean that is ready for the reality of now. So all of what we've been programmed to think is like this CPU has to be wiped and started all over again. The kids are pretty easy. You can get at them in the formal and informal settings. We kind of messed them up in the house, but, you know, they're resilient, thank God. But we're the trouble. We have to get adults in every single sector to think differently. We have to get financial people to understand how to budget every year when they come to their budgetary proposals for resilience. We don't even like to budget for maintenance now. So it's a complete rethink in terms of how we have to get financial people to rethink. We have to get architects to build differently. We need sacrificial floors. We used to build sacrificial floors. It was called building on stilts, but it wasn't modern. Now we have to go back to things that we did before, because if the flood passes underneath your house, you are safe on the floors above. So we have to get the architects to rethink. We have to get the urban planners to rethink. They can't be one road in and one road out. That's a nuisance on a daily basis because we can't get where we're needing to go. We're in these triangle holes of traffic, congestion. Imagine what it's like after an event. So, yeah, we have to re-socialize. We have to reprogram ourselves in every single profession to plan for the worst case scenario. It is not actually the worst case scenario, it's now the norm. So maybe we have to create a new worst case scenario so they'll accept this, or we will accept this as the norm.
Yeah, and I remember when I was much younger, I used to want to see what a hurricane looks like.
Yes,
because the older people used to say Hurricane Charlie, and there was a lot of stuff. And I really wanted to see what it was like. But during the middle of a hurricane, I decided I didn't want it anymore. and the reality is that we have to educate everyone. And that's why I was saying, just to agree with you, that whatever is happening is an opportunity for every one of us, in that people will actually see what is happening so they can understand. What is also happening as well is that our professionals need to do their jobs. But enforcement is normally one of the most critical things. In a lot of scenarios, yes, everybody's abiding by the policies, the plans are approved properly, but the person who's building it now takes shortcuts. And those who are supposed to be enforcing, due to probably turning a blind eye, and probably about not having enough resources, enforcement is a very serious, serious issue. One of the best sermons I've ever listened to was at a World Town Planning Day sermon in Jamaica, in that the pastor spoke about planning, and he spoke about resiliency, and he also spoke about these events that are happening. And I saw the audience, actually, they were captured, and they were listening to the pastor. I believe that the world and other faith-based, the church, other faith-based organizations, the leaders also have a role to play in educating all of us on it as well. And one of the challenges we also have, though, is to actually get into various areas. How do you really get into areas where there are crime issues? How do you get into areas where informal developments, and try to explain to people that because of where you live, something has to be done? That is normally a challenge that we ourselves are trying to address and grapple with. And I think we have started to see some of the solutions because of the opportunities provided. That after most of these events, people are realizing that probably they made a mistake as well. What we have also found is that in Jamaica itself, in that there's this concept of a sponge city. Most people have heard of sponge city concept. It's a concept that actually looks on how you can address floodwaters within your city. In that instead of trying to repel it, it actually comes in, but how it is handled within your city is important. And this is something we're looking on exploring as well. But my major things is, one, it is education. It is enforcement and monitoring. That is something that we'll have to focus on as much as we can. And professionals, I think we need to license our professionals.
For me,
so professionals need some time. Some of them probably need to be locked up.
For me, what's fundamental is a lesson I learned while doing a citizen security project in St. Lucia. We had a chance to go up to Sir Arthur Lewis's monument, and what is written on it is, to eradicate poverty is not money. What is knowledge? And we had some issues in that project, and the persons are here today who were working with me, and we went back to them, and I said, you want to be resilient in Castries. What is your intention? What do you want? And I think having knowledge about what your other party's intention is about is critical, because you begin to have buy-in. And at the end of the day, we didn't have an infrastructure project. We had a project that targeted youth at risk in the community. The business wanted to have youth that they could train. The wanted to have after-school programs, because you hear about the 2008 financial issues, but it trickled into that community where people lost jobs. And so again, it's important that you find out what is the other person's intention. With that knowledge, you move from a level of commitment to action. And there is this collective buying. Because as I said before, everybody needs to understand what is their role in the urban economy, because it links back to GDP. When you say to them, after an event, and you see that X percentage of GDP has been reduced because of an event, so that's some of yours. How are you going to participate in getting it back up to where it is? And I think when we begin to have that discussion with businesses, they begin to say, okay, then we can look at resilience a little bit better. We do not use our moral thing to say, okay, I don't want to spend so much money on a resilient thing this year. That's a discussion. And I think in the revised urban sector policy and strategy, you will see where we have TAs dedicated to doing that level of investment and unlocking that knowledge with our BMCs, because that is key. You could get any amount of money allocated to your resilience initiative, but it could be spent in something totally different. And at the end of the day, the people who are to be benefited are not going to be benefited. And I think from CDB's perspective, who is very committed to poverty reduction and in an inclusive manner, and you will see that in the policy and strategy document coming out soon, we are going to make sure that we not only have these products as an infrastructure, we're going to have projects that are in security, we're going to have projects that deal with land titling, and we're going to have projects that deal with legislation. Because when you have that discussion with your stakeholder and you begin to tease out what is your intention, what do you need to move that intention, probably it's not an infrastructure, it's a legislative issue. I mean, when you look at small and medium-sized enterprise and you go back to say, what is your intention? And you say, okay, do you need money? You give them money, the money is not moving. You go back and you find out, oh, there are legislation in place where if the female is married, she can't take out the loan unless, so the money, so again, we go back to having that discussion with our stakeholders and beginning to build within our product and services. How do we understand your intention and move the intention from commitment to action with a view to building resilience and letting them understand that resilience is not a foreign concept. Because we all sit in here and have this very professional conversation. But the reality is, we need to make sure that everybody outside in the region who is living on the Gully Bank, who decide to have a dance and block the airport, these are some of the things that we need to have that discussion and say, they understand their role. And I think my other team member who's here with Sharon, she will agree with me that if at the end of the day, the bottom of the pyramid understand their role in resilience and how is it they participate, the middle of the pyramid and the 1%, I think we would have accomplished. And I think what follows next would be undoubtedly GDP growth and just a greater social cohesion and understanding as to what role they play in development.
I think what everybody's talking about is driving incentives. And how do you think the policy will help that? And what other areas do you think we need to really push the incentives for individuals, for politicians, for institutions to really make a step change in this area?
Well, I think one of the elements that's contained in the policy that will be helpful is partnerships. CDB is not doing this on its own. The policy actually identifies the relationship between CDB other regional, financial, and other partners, including civil society, because taking Kevon's point in terms of inclusion, making everybody a part of it, the policy identifies the roles to be played, how CDB, first of all, it starts with capacity building at the level of CDB in terms of making CDB officers ready to implement and roll out this new vision of urban development and urban sector growth and resilience. And then it positions CDB in relation to key partners, regionally, extra-regionally, financial, and otherwise. Because obviously, it's an urban policy. It can't only look at infrastructure, and it mustn't. It can't only look at money, and it mustn't. It must deal with health. It must deal with education. It must deal with all sorts of other issues, which are dealt with by several of the partners who are attending this meeting right now. And so the policy identifies how the opportunities for those partnerships might begin to encourage the growth and the change necessary in the region to move us to where we want to be. So I think partnerships is a key element of, where CDB can position itself. And it's already working with several. The video showed us the relationship that has already built up with UNDP, and it works with the IDB and other agencies. But in this new policy, that is a key focus, and it really strengthens those partnerships moving forward. And I think it's also an exemplary way in which several other entities in the region could look to themselves forming partnerships. A lot of the people that we want to help are voiceless. But when you speak on behalf of somebody, you have to be certain that you're saying genuinely what they want, which ideally is truthfully they should say themselves. So as Kevon is saying, people have to be included. And that's another key element within the policy, talking about the role, the central role for the disabled, the disenfranchised, people living with HIV, single-parented households, persons who are in informal settlements, not seeing them as people outside of a discourse, but bringing them into a discourse and recognizing that this is not what they want for themselves, but for circumstances, this is where they are. So understanding it and being able to get them in the conversation to move themselves forward. So those are some of the elements that are contained within the policy. And yes, I think it would be very exciting perhaps to come back like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, to see how it's rolling out and to really monitor, as Leonard said, and see the changes, measure those changes. And also built into it is adaptability, because we don't want to go off down a path and think this is perfect. So there's sort of a loop for reflection. Is this working? Is it achieving the goal that we have set? And therefore, how do we necessarily need to shift to move towards the goal? Maybe indeed some of the goals may change. We know what the current circumstances now, but chances are things might adjust or shift. And so the policy allows for some adjustment as well. So it's a very flexible policy in that regard.
I think our approach really is, I listened to Kevin a while ago, and he said resilience isn't foreign.
Yes,
and I think the approach in terms of education is a return to heritage.
Yes.
Because if we look at initially our first damage assessors were SEDEMA, and they said, you need to move away from using shingles. But it's, in our case, probably not properly applied, and you need to go back to the familiar zinc roof or the familiar concrete roof that our grandparents used to use. And I mean, they were resilient. They always had redundancy plans. So even when electricity went in my grandmother's house, if you're not in that room, turn that light off. You're not using the light, turn it off. Conservation. Should never get rid of the lantern or the lamp because the electricity could go off. But we never think the electricity could go off.
Yes.
And we always think when we turn on the tap, the water's going to come on. And though they had cisterns, when a hurricane comes, you fill up the tub, you fill up the zincs, you fill up everything. So it isn't as foreign. I think we need to, and I'm dwelling on what you're saying, because to me, the biggest stumbling block, I'm right back there, is even to getting those partners, those critical partners, and individual buy-in to say, but listen, this is innate. This is what we knew. We just have to get back to what was actually better in many, many respects. So I think it would help in terms of trying to, you know, foist something new on people to understand that this is what our grandparents did.
Yes, and I agree with you totally. And I was going to say something like that, because what I realize is this. If we should ask ourselves just one question, that if we are taken out, we are placed on an island without water and everything else, right? I'm talking about us in this room today, though. What would happen? Because what I realized is that I visited a community once in Jamaica and we had a hurricane. And I was worrying myself a whole lot. But guess what happened? The persons who were suffering the most were the so-called middle-class persons. The other persons and the older persons, they were cooking, they were busy fixing back whatever because they accepted it as part of life. And they were moving on with their lives. They were not running up and down. So I believe that we need to get back. We need to learn from those who came before us. What happened before? We need to look on that. Because I'm quite surprised that when you talk to older people, they had a system in place that they would help each other. If you had a hurricane and your roof was going or something was happening, there would be the other person's house. If there's a food issue after an hurricane, the food would be shared up some way. I don't know how they did it, but they found some very, I think, probably equitable way to do everything. So we need to look back on that. We need to look back on the materials we are using. Yes, everything looks exciting and shiny and new and beautiful. But can we survive in that rain is falling, right? And people are complaining that they don't have any water. There's no water in the pipe, right? So this resilience concept, building resilience in cities, is about what do we do and how we go about it. I remember I was in a country once and there were some beautiful grapefruits on the tree. And I'm talking about urban agriculture now. Beautiful grapefruits. So as a Jamaican, I believe I could just eat grapefruits like that. But those persons from those countries said, no, you cannot eat the grapefruits. You have to go to the store. They have to be government approved, that they have FDA approved on them before you can eat them. No, I was very curious about that, right? In that, I have seen people actually, even in Jamaica itself, you have beautiful mangoes growing in your trees. Some people actually buy mangoes, you know, and there are mangoes there. So I don't know, in that we have to go back. We have to have this discussion with the population. And some of us believe it's a poor people having a problem. No. All of us are having a problem. Myself, I'm having a problem. Can we survive when every dollar in our account is wiped out and your credit card is not working? Are you resilient? I think we have to look on it from all those perspectives.
Perhaps that's a neat opportunity to open it up to the floor for questions. Are there some questions that people would like to ask? I'm keen to take a few and then put those to the panel.
Yes. Hello? I'm not sure how many people listened to CNN this morning, but on CNN they were talking about Puerto Rico. And one day before the start of the hurricane season, there are still people in Puerto Rico who don't have electricity. And Puerto Rico is a part of the US. What does that mean for countries in the Caribbean who are not so well off? Another statistics came out of that news report. The official death toll from Puerto Rico was 65.
No.
But in the aftermath, a report just came out, 4,600 people died in the aftermath. What that is showing us is, coming out of the discussions today, is that as the panelists spoke, we are all affected, or can be affected, or will be affected. Dr. Antoine spoke in his presentation about the need to be ready before the event Yes. From a debt perspective or from a financial perspective or from a fiscal perspective. There are other vulnerabilities that we face, whether it's our water, it's our energy, whether it's our wastewater or telecoms, which we have to face before. You cannot speak about resilience without talking about vulnerability. True. So I totally support what Dr. Kummerbach is saying. There's a need to identify the factors that we are vulnerable to in order for us to become resilient. And so I would suggest or recommend that in the policy, if it's not in there already, it captures, it looks at vulnerability and how we become resilient. Thank you.
If I can respond to that, and the challenge is for our bar member countries. We're proposing some TA support where countries can tap into us and say, and answer that same question. Mm-hmm. The reality is we are committed to supporting, to reduce what is considered as business interruption. Business in terms of the government services, as well as the private sector services. And what we will do is to provide resources so that there can be that level of assessment. To say not what only we need before in terms of mitigation measures, but given the vulnerability, what do we do after to reduce that lapse? Because that is where you have systemic issues that are oftentimes not covered by the 800 million for the disaster reconstruction. So we are aware of that. And within our products and services under the revised urban sector strategy, we will consider that. And how we start to unlock any major investment is to use that knowledge product to help. I give you an example. Production function theory has evolved. It's no longer labor, capital, and material. And there are opportunities for us to say, how do we apply that to resilience? Countries coming to us to say, if we do X, Y, and Z, what does it look like for us? Those are the type of discussions that we will facilitate and we will support, because you need to have that level of assessment so that we can properly, because remember we said before, money is not the only solution. True. So we need to make sure that, as you rightly say, do that level of assessment so that we can properly unlock.
Yeah, and just in part of that as well, in that I never want to say it, but I have to say it. I was actually in Turks and Caicos when they had the hurricane, and that's when I learned something very important. You also have to have resilient leaders. I just showed the premiere photograph I took with her. She was all over Turks and Caicos, actually rallying the troops, getting things going. So the reality is that you have to have resilient leaders as well. And the leaders that will actually say, listen, this needs to be done and get it done. And I think that's a very important part of the conversation as well.
Another question.
Sure. Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the panel. We've spoken quite a bit about what individuals need to do, and thanks for focusing, Doc, on the community aspect of it. From my perspective personally, and of course as a member of CDB, one of my bugbears, and this would be to you, Honorable Premier, and we have many politicians in the room, some newly minted. What do we do with the issue of maintenance?
Yes, that's
it. Isn't sexy. Yes, politicians don't cut ribbons. I believe was the quote. Politicians don't cut ribbons to open maintenance. It's not done. And then, I mean, not that CDB, we're not pushing back the business when you come to us for new infrastructure 5-10 years down the road, but infrastructure that should really have a life cycle of
20, 30 years, you know, last 5 to 7 in the region, and this is across all of our board member countries, you know, we're doing pretty terribly when it comes to maintenance. So to the panel and to the other politicians represented here, what about maintenance? Because we can't speak to resilience without addressing maintenance.
True. Absolutely correct. And thank you, Daniel. Because I'm very pleased that even about this before the storm, we were actually devising the first ever maintenance policy. The impact that government has had on its buildings is because a number of buildings, as you can imagine, governments across the Caribbean, I wouldn't say the world, we build buildings, we build roads, and we leave it until it's completely dilapidated, and then we have to spend more money. So our approach, my new government coming into office, said, look here, we're going to pick a really bad building, a building in between, and then do light maintenance, and we're going to do that on a schedule. So we literally passed a maintenance policy October last year that looks at maintenance on a schedule. Now, Irma came and sped that along. She had a different idea. So now we have an opportunity to, unfortunately, build back everything at the same time. So which means the maintenance, we have a challenge going forward if you can see it. So if we say we're going to maintain every 10 years, we have probably about 20 buildings that's going to come up at the same time. So we still have to look at how we stagger because it does cost money. But the whole policy initiative and the spirit behind that was to make sure we continue to maintain. Likewise, we're creating the roads policy as well to do the same thing.
I think that there's a word that has not been mentioned as yet, and it's called sacrifice.
You don't say that.
You don't say that? Okay, well, I will be put out of country by tonight, but I will say it. Because part of the reason why we haven't maintained is that we always know what we have to spend our money on, and there's just never enough for that. I don't have enough left back, I'm so sorry. So, in my layman's language, it's called sacrifice. What do I have to give up when I'm doing my budget to make sure I have enough for maintenance? And I have to do that as a house owner, I have to do that at the level of community, and I have to do it at the level of a government. So, when you've put your budget together and there is nothing in maintenance, you need to start scraping something. You're talking about going back to the old time days where people used to manage a household on very little. You start scraping something from all those other heads and putting them onto the maintenance budget. Something has to give. It is another part of that re-socialization process that I talked about. Re-socialized into understanding that you must put something in the maintenance budget, which means that you will go without something else. And look, you managed to live without it though.
That's right.
And perhaps, you know, a certain percentage of us in here are parents. We do that all of the time. You can live without that child. You don't need that. You can have something else. It is simply a process of bringing to fore several of the values and norms that make up our culture that we've walked away from and bringing them to the fore again. So take it from here, put it there. If you look at your budget and you don't have anything in maintenance, something is wrong. Bring something over to maintenance. It must happen.
And for me, it's not only about your physical infrastructure in respect of maintenance. Most of us probably would have hit before we actually came here. How are we maintaining our soils so that we can actually, because resiliency in Aboriginal cities also about feeding people. Are we maintaining our soils? Are we maintaining our genetic diversity in respect of our crops, animals, whatever it is? Are we maintaining our watersheds? Are we maintaining our underground water solutions in that we are busily polluting it with a lot of wastewater and otherwise? Are we maintaining the health of our people? In that what we are seeing a higher level of homelessness. We're seeing some people argue that most of us have mental issues. Some people, at least probably 60% of Caribbean people. I've seen some studies going around. But
that's part of the resilience.
But so maintenance is not only about the physical. There's a lot of things we need to maintain if we are going to continue and improve along the path in which we are going. And so what just to conclude on the point, that as people, we're seeing right through the Caribbean, we are rapidly depleting our agricultural lands. We're converting them to homes. We're doing a lot of things that, I don't know, if we should have a major incident and we cannot get food into our Caribbean territories, what happens?
I take it that's agriculture.
Do you have another question? Oh, the gentleman at the back first, and then...
Well, it wasn't a question. It was to respond as a politician to the question that was asked. I arrived late, so apologies if it was covered before. But as I entered, there was a lot of discussion about what we need to be doing in terms of education, whether it's in our schools, households, etc. And what we're talking about is a fundamental mindset change.
Yes.
Yes.
But that also includes us as politicians. It
Yes.
includes us as governments. And we heard the example from the Turks and Caicos where measures are being put in place. In Grenada, in terms of our fiscal responsibility rules, we have committed to putting contingencies in place, even though we are just scratching the surface. But I think the point is investment is required in good times. There's a lot of talk about building back better after an event, and then but that is at a time where you have to reprioritize. You do not have the luxury of time.
No.
And the realities of building back better are often actually impossible because of the rush just to get back on your feet. So it's about investing during good times where you have the space, you have the time to plan properly, to make provision for. And there are responsibilities that we as government, as citizens, need to take. But that also is a time where the international community also needs to understand that it's not about responding to events, it's also providing support, technical and financial, during those good times so that we can make provisions for those events. But the education process, I think, is across the board, from child, at a national level, at an international level in terms of the support.
The gentleman at the back.
My name's James Hospitalis. I'm the Executive Director of the Caribbean Public Health Agency. I acknowledge my Secretary General and others nearby. Looking at the theme of this, building resilient cities, I've been enjoying all the conversation, and while I come from health, it's interesting, the financial acronyms are different, but the settings and young people, threat and opportunity, the need to monitor and enforce, maintenance, these are the same themes, it seems, across sectors. I'm also the chair of the expert panel on climate and health for the Caribbean, which I co-chair with someone from the University of Tulane. And we'll be launching a report shortly that looks at the downsizing of the climate science for the Caribbean and the implications for us, which throughout this whole meeting and echoed last year are profound, the social, the environmental, and the economic implications. I wrote a piece that came out on the 27th for the G7 Charlevoix publication and asked, what could the G7 do to help us with this situation? And one of the suggestions I pitched in there, I want to ask the opinion of the panel, since we're talking about resilient cities. And it was about one of the strategic imperatives from the panel on climate and health was to look at built environment and health, particularly alternative transportation, biking and walking, and rapid mass transport. Rapid mass transport, I told a German ambassador could sell Germany some more Mercedes-Benz buses. And everybody who sells bikes and walking shoes and everything else like that can also get in on the app. But this is good for health. We have a serious problem with non-communicable diseases. We're hemorrhaging financially.
Yes.
It's good for the planet, and it's good for energy security. If you can convert 20% of the trips less than 5 kilometers to bike or walk and have a good rapid mass transportation, you can quantify the savings to energy security. And it's good for tourism. So it's not even a triple, but it's a quadruple bottom line return. So my question to the panel is, how can we do this? How can we do this when in school a little boy tells me the teacher, it's always a miss who does this, puts a chalk mark on his head, and when he goes outside, he must not come back inside sweaty. How are we going to get people to ride bikes if that is the attitude of teachers in schools? How are we going to get them to ride bikes if no malls even have a parking place for bikes? So I've taken, not matters into my own hands, that's the wrong word, but I met with our mayor and said, let's start a bike share scheme, starting with CARFA, the Federation Park Association, and the two near my balls. I want my staff to stop driving 500 meters to the mall. We put signage, let's start somewhere. So the question to you is, how do we get something like that going in the Caribbean that would benefit health, the planet, the economy, and tourism? What's your opinion as part of building resilient cities?
I see Sharon stood up, so perhaps she wanted to respond to this.
Yes, I actually want to respond to that. From the perspective of Barbados, for instance, Barbados has just completed its new physical development plan, and within that physical development plan, they're focusing heavily on marine mobility and reducing the use of the motor vehicle. So within the new physical development plan, they're looking at persons utilizing more bicycles, having more buses, using more buses. I see Marsha smiling because I know within the BLP's manifesto, they also spoke to reintroducing flyovers and all those sort of controversial things. But Barbados also has the highest and the most dense road network in the Caribbean per square kilometer of any island. And Barbados really, I would not say they don't need any more roads, but they need to maintain the roads that they presently have. But using the new initiatives within the physical development plan of introducing, like for instance in Bridgetown, introducing pedestrianized streets, because we have that with Swan Street, and that is something they're also looking at for Bridgetown, and encouraging persons to more walk and to use more buses as opposed to using motor vehicles. I know that that will be a serious change in culture, and I know just walking from point A to point B, even today when I walked across here with my jacket on, which I don't like, I had a good sweat. So in our culture, I know some of these things are going to be a little difficult to introduce, but it can be a cultural change, and it's something we can look at even from the policy level of a physical development plan being introduced within countries.
So I wanted to respond because thank you very much, Dr. Hospitalis. When we were working on this policy, the team comprised Italian, British, American, Barbadian. Julia, our Italian planner, wanted to see more of what you're describing. We were staying in the Spanish court in Jamaica. She wanted to go to Devon House. It was Saturday morning. I said, let's go. It was around 9 o'clock. We took a stroll to Devon House, and we took a stroll back. I emphasize stroll because there was no sense that you were going to walk fast. It was too hot. We were both drenched at the end of the day. I did that because I wanted Julia to understand that in the context of introducing more healthy walking options and biking options, we have to embrace a few more things. I needed more trees.
Yes, that's true.
I needed an opportunity along the way for perhaps a bar to stop and have a coconut water. A little rum in the coconut water might not have been remiss. It was Saturday morning, and I was hosting someone from outside of the region. So it is an opportunity not just for health in the context of the walking, but it's an opportunity for us to bring more greenery back into our urban spaces, because we must, if we're talking about socially inclusive spaces, yes, think about what makes you comfortable. When you leave the Caribbean and you go into environments where you walk, what's in those environments other than a lower temperature? Yes. They have trees.
Yes.
They have places where you can stop, have a sit down, have a stare, have a drink, whatever. So we have to put all of that into the design. You can't just put in the opportunity for the cycling. It has to be a fully integrated process. So I fully embrace the idea of the biking, but as I've explained to my students and my colleagues, I am not leaving my campus of the University of the West Indies and walking up to Warren's for lunch. They will not see me for a while, unless I have options for refreshing myself and being cool along the way. It's very doable, but the stumbling block comes because people only see, let's put bikes there. We have to put the bikes, we have to put the dedicated bike lane so we don't kill the bikers. Okay? It has to be integrated. It's very doable, but let's not dismiss it because we only see the sweat and the heat. Let's understand it in its integrated context.
Yeah. Well, look, before you move on, because I'm glad the doctor raised that, because at the end of the day, we are killing ourselves in the Caribbean. It isn't just even the movement, it's the diet. We've just actually returned the Ministry of Health after the sports, after however many, perhaps decades back with the Ministry of Health. We're tying sports and health together because in Turks and Caicos, with our very small population, we lose about 70% of the deaths to non-communicable diseases, heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, kidney failure. And you know, we're increasing in these numbers. I mean, I don't know in Turks and Caicos that I can sell biking. We don't have any trees. Any Bermudans here? We claim the Bermudans cut down our trees and they never grew back. Right? The truth is, it is hot, it is humid. Right? And then who you're trying to get to buy in, the young people expect to jump in and jump out. So what we're trying to look at is multi-sports. Get them into swimming. Get them into something else that gets them going. But the truth is, it is important that we have those discussions because we'll talk about building better and looking at the future, and there is no future because the diabetics and hypertensives are getting younger. So most of them can't ride bike anyway. The sun too hot, they got hypertension. You know, I mean, we're chuckling, but the truth is we are in trouble in terms of health.
Yes, we are.
Well, I've never been good at video games, but a lot more people are playing games on the phones and everything else. But in Jamaica, being the director of a spatial plan division, what we are trying to do several things at the same time, right? In that we are looking on this densification efforts. We are trying to look on the mixed-use efforts. But you know, people do not like densification, really. When you see these tall buildings or building massed together, what they say, you are destroying our neighborhoods. But we are trying to push that for each local planning areas that we should have open spaces within them.
Yes, we do.
So as a part of the process, when we do a new plan and we identify local planning areas, say, listen, we need to purchase this amount of lands to be used for open space. Yes. We're also pushing the development of local plans in that with these local plans, we're looking one street at a time, one block at a time. And the idea is that we would have a 3D plans, and within this plan itself is going to look on your sidewalks to make them walkable. Some of our sidewalks are a bit steep, they are too narrow, all of these. So that part of the plan is to develop these, that walking will be pleasurable, right? And walking and we believe that that is something that needs to be done.
We're fast running out of time, so if I could just take these last two questions together, and if I could please ask you to be very brief, and maybe in answering those questions, could the panel then also maybe just give a kind of closing sentence each on kind of what the most important thing is for them. So if the gentleman could give his question first, and then the lady at the back.
Yes, just a couple of suggestions for consideration in developing the ideas on building resilient cities. The perception of resilience is one that is infrastructure related, and we need to try and change that. That resilience is not just in building stronger bridges and wider drains and these things, but it's also a mindset and an overall picture that we are looking at. Building resilience should begin with the home, because after any major disaster, the first area we are affected is the home. True. And if the houses are damaged, then they end up in the schools and in the public buildings, and all other activities must stop during that time. Now, we still have so many people building plywood houses and building houses that do not meet the basic standards to withstand a Category 2 storm, far less a Category 5. So that needs to be taken into consideration. The focus should be in the area of helping each country to deal with. So let me take CDB as an example. What are you doing to or how can you work with the local development banks in the various countries in terms of creating synergies and helping to develop the local capacity within these institutions, and to be able to maybe manage some of the things in collaboration with the bigger entity, which is CDB, so that we can, the resilience we are talking about is not limited just to dumping all of the burdens on one institution. And the last point I would make on this is the quick response that is required is not forthcoming. So you have a disaster. Yes, you may have the catastrophic risk insurance coming and making some money available. But even the professionals that we spoke about, how quickly can we adjust? And I will use this one example. After Hurricane Thomas in St. Lucia, all the bridges up to the north were wiped out. I came in and the engineers said to me, look here, you cannot touch this bridge. We have to do all the studies that were required. I tell them, I tried to convince them we need to get the country going. They said no. I said, okay, everybody go home. When they came back at 7 o'clock in the morning, the bridge was passable because people could have moved. Because in responding to disaster, one of the things we must be able to do is to inspire people that we can build back after the process. And so I believe where we need to be in the Caribbean is that we need to do a general study of the country itself, know all the areas that are vulnerable, and start preparing for it, because the hurricanes will not wait for us to be ready. And if we can do that, then we would be better prepared to deal with the other resilience factors that are required. Thank you.
Okay. The lady at the back.
Thank you very much. I'm Darren Newman from Caribbean Development Bank. All this discussion, I mean, from the lecture last night, it had me thinking about social protection. I mean, social protection as a form of social policy that gets, you know, undermined or overshadowed at times, especially when we don't have the fiscal space and there are reductions. But if you go back to the original discourse around social protection, it really is to create those buffers so that people can be able to just withstand the shocks. Whether you're talking about an unemployment insurance or you're talking about conditional cash transfers, these things are here to help to build up resilience, to give you the assets. And what I like about it is that it is anticipatory, it is proactive, and it is preventative. A lot of what we don't do in our planning is the preventative side. And people have been saying it, but just to bring that back in, that in our planning frameworks, and we talk about integrated approaches, social protection has to be a part of that. Even if we cannot finance all the programs and, you know, the full package, we have to be mindful that this is a part of human development, it is a part of public policy, and it needs to be given the priority. And underpinning it is a resilience focus. It's not a safety net, but it's a springboard for people to graduate and accumulate assets over time. When you get it right, you have less vulnerability, susceptibility to resilience. I just wanted to put it in there in the discussion as a part of the policy perspective. Integrated planning with social policy, with economic policy, and don't forget your social protection strategy whenever you can, and try to build it up over time, because it will save us in the future from major losses. Thanks.
And our final question.
Yes, sorry, I wasn't going to respond, but CDB forced my hand by speaking to what the government of Barbados is doing. So I do want to mention the idea of urban renewal that has been very much a part of our platform as the Barbados Labour Party, as Sharon mentioned, our manifesto, which will now become policy. But similar to what Darren was just saying, which is why I was asking the Director of Projects just now about what you were saying, Kavon, about this policy that you were describing, which sounds very much like what is facing us in Barbados. Because a lot of what we have to do is simultaneous policy in a lot of different areas that puts people in the position to take advantage of what we want, what we are saying that we want. So it's all right to talk about physical development planning that has bike paths and all this, and this is very much a part of what we want to see as the government of Barbados. But we are in a situation now where people are barely hanging on. To tell a person who has to get to work by a certain time, who has to take children to school in a situation where there are no buses, that we want you to walk. I mean, we have to get real, and we have to understand that we have to bring the population to a place through several different interventions where they can take advantage of the kinds of things that we want to see. So I'm very much interested in this policy, Kevon, that you're talking about, because it sounds to me like it sees urban renewal and urban planning through all the different lenses that are required. It cannot just be a physical development plan. It has to be who is unemployed, where do they need to get to, what are the physical transport systems that are going to get them there. Time is an economic input. So it's all right for us to say we want people to walk, but are we creating the environment in which they will get there on time, in which they can get their children to school first before they go to work, where they are actually going to work? Is it that we also need to allow for common spaces that make sense to different groups of people? So, you know, I'm very interested to hear more about this, but also to understand that our countries are not in the same position. And so when we talk about resilience, I mean, another big part of our platform has been the idea of climate-proofing homes for working class people, for low-income people, so that the incentives have to make sense to people who are below, for example, in Barbados, the $20,000 threshold a year. These are real issues that come up in countries whose economies are in crisis situations. So I just want to remind us that we also have to sit back and have a really practical perspective on where our countries and economies are and how to get them to this place that we want them to be. Thank you.
If I could respond, and I'm glad the minister from St. Lucia made that point, because working with us in an initiative, it was clear from CDB's perspective that resilience is not only about infrastructure, because he can say at the end of the day, the product that we got was a youth resilience initiative, which was totally different from what we started with. Yes. And I think the policy, CDB, understands that, and that's part of the reason why we're doing it. And in terms of the inclusive approach, I could go back to, this is not something that we are dreaming about. This is something that we have done in St. Lucia. Part of that project to deal with citizen security was pulling different agencies together. And I'm happy that Darren spoke about social security, because that was a critical part of the solution. And not only did we end up having a product that cut across different ministries and agencies, stakeholders working together, at the end of it, another international development agency wanted to join us to fund an initiative in Castries. So when we speak about this policy and it being inclusive, and it is not just a sectoral approach, we understand where it is coming from. And we understand that the solution is not a one-cut thing. We have to work with our development partners. We have to work with our borrowing member countries with the main understanding, what is your intention? And with that, we can build an excellent product. It's interesting that we have such a wonderful product, because it's not in its implementation stage as yet. But the mere fact that we are at this stage and we realize that to build resilient city is not putting up a bridge, it's working together. And CDB, even the products that we develop, the projects, it's going to be working with our partners. When you come and you have a community center, we're going to say, okay, what's the intention of having these community centers? What are the other stakeholders that need to be a part of this? And at the end of the day, I'm sure that what we have is a product that meets the development objective of inclusive development. Okay, I'm getting the signal.
Can I just ask the rest of the panel to give a very, very brief closing point?
Very, very brief. At the risk of offending those who are tired of hearing the word timely, but certainly the policy is timely. We are, those of us who would have suffered through the recent storms are going through our own private health. But here you have a regional institution that is looking not in a broad brush way, but looking at the individual nations and wanting to partner with the individual countries, not just those that are impacted recently, but going forward on how we can build and build back better. I think, as I close, 2 quick challenges. Getting the buy-in is critical. But as my political colleague spoke a while ago, it flows from leadership. Leadership has to buy in. We have to manage expectations, and we have to make sure our people understand that you can't build back resiliently quickly. It takes time. We are in a microwave generation, the older people say. But the fact is, either you take time and rebuild, or after every storm that is sure to come, you build back again. So I think that is the message that we have to say to our people, that either you take your time and do it right, or you keep doing it every time. With that, I thank CDB for the initiative, because that is critical, and whilst we didn't get into all the meat of the policy, it is something that I would recommend, because it goes beyond infrastructure. It goes way beyond that, and appreciate all of the factors that marries into planning. And planning for Caribbean people is still a very difficult thing. We have a really serious problem with planning. Not only do we have a serious problem with planning, but when we adopt this policy, we have a problem with implementation. So from one politician to the politicians that are here, it is important that when we look at this policy, that we ensure that we see it throughout and make sure we implement it, because it only can help us.
Janice, briefly, thank you.
Thank you. So we build because of people. The only reason we're doing this is because of people. We're not doing the bridges and the roads and everything else for themselves. We're doing it because of people. I feel an attachment to this policy. It's my baby, so I want to see it grow and thrive. So I have some indicators of growth for it. In 10 years, I will be looking to see that throughout all my urban spaces, everyone has access. There'll be ramps, there'll be rails, there'll be proper lights and security. There'll be spaces to include all people. I want to see that my people have a voice, because the Caribbean people, the Caribbean governments bought into this policy and implemented it, utilizing the facilities that are built into the policy to bring these things to reality. A voice for the people, a space for the people. Reducing the vulnerability. I need to be able to go in 10 years and have all the data in front of me and to see that the vulnerable have shrunk. And I have the evidence to prove it. And because I'll probably be walking with a limp, I can go up the ramp and hold the rail, and I can see well to do so.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I think we need to plan, we need to develop and implement, we need to monitor, we need to enforce, and then there has to be in place a system to ensure that whatever we've implemented, we can measure the output and the outcome.
Yes.
That's it.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I'm sorry that we've overrun a little bit. I think I speak for all of us when I say that we really look forward to this policy coming to the board later in the year. And with that, I'll close the session. Thank you.
Thank you.